From the William B. Travis Building in Austin, Texas, we're keeping Texas energy on track. Here's your host, Bryce Doobie.
Welcome to Texas Energy on Track, the official podcast of the Railroad Commission of Texas. I am your host, Bryce Doobie, joined as always by our producer and co-host, Nick Cranock. Nick, how are you doing?
Doing great. Always fun to be doing another podcast episode. And I think, as I always say, it's another interesting topic. But that's true because we're just peeling away at the onion of all the different things that we cover at the commission and, regulate all over the state.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one, honestly, topic-wise, I've been really interested in talking about on the show. A lot of folks know with the Railroad Commission, we regulate oil, we regulate gas. Some of our other little things we do, we've talked about with like surface reclamation and some of our things with produced water and different things like that. There's so many more things, I mean, we can get into with coal and uranium and so many things.
Pipelines.
Oh, yeah. Pipeline safe. We've had a couple of pipeline episodes. Like there's been so many different things, but this one, it's still under the ground and it's a thing, but it's such a different topic and it's so interesting. So I'm really excited to talk about geothermal energy today with Jared Ware, who is a senior engineer and systems analyst here at the Railroad Commission. Jared, how are you doing today?
Hey, great, Bryce. Thanks for inviting me to talk today.
Absolutely. Let's get right into it with just talking a little bit about yourself first. What is your background? How long have you been at the commission? What did you do before you came to the RRC?
I started at the Railroad Commission back in 2018, and I was hired as the manager of the Well Mapping Department, or GIS department. And then about a year, I left the agency to go to Army Futures Command to help stand them up, and then returned in 2022 as the director of Critical Infrastructure Division. And then really the past 2 years, I've been primarily focused on geothermal energy and kind of developing the rules and regulations for that. And then I've also kind of built some knowledge working in Class 5, Class 6 underground injection control wells. So really the carbon dioxide storage and then lithium brine. So those are kind of the areas, but primarily focused on geothermal.
So some of these more unique situations that the Railroad Commission does regulate, there's just some interesting spaces out there because at the end of the day, it's still going underground, going deeper and doing things, but these are different types of things that we regulate than oil and gas, for example.
Really, in the last legislative session, we pretty much took control of all that with kind of the change in Senate Bill 786, which moved pretty much all geothermal energy and associated resources to the Railroad Commission from Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So it came kind of from a water culture. We're an energy culture, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But that's really kind of primarily everything's kind of migrating into energy, and Railroad Commission is energy.
So for listeners out there who may not know at the most like basic entry level to thing, like how do you explain geothermal energy? I mean, breaking it down, earth, thermal, like temperatures, heat, and things. I promise I'm actually know what I'm talking about sometimes. But what is it?
Yeah, I'll say from a baseline level, it's getting heat from the earth. And I would kind of break that down is kind of using subsurface sources of heat to gain kind of a thermal advantage of the ambient temperature. So that's a little bit more involved, but it's really being able to take advantage of the naturally occurring heat in the subsurface and turn that into energy and in some cases electricity.
Oh, so because, I mean, once you start getting down pretty deep, it does get hot and there's different ways to harness that, it sounds like, and turn that into different things.
Yeah, there is. And kind of another aspect with the regulation is kind of the direct heat. So in a lot of cases, we look at the well being able to use some sort of working fluid. Working fluid comes up, turns into steam, or it spins a turbine, kind of goes back into that cycle. But there's also the direct heat usage if a facility wanted to use it and basically kind of moderate the temperature to grow certain crops, then there's a ability to use a geothermal well for that as well.
What are the main types, like when we're talking about all of this, like what are some of the main types of like geothermal resources found here in Texas? Is it all kind of created equal, or with different geologic formations? Are we looking at different types of things, or what?
I'd say Texas is interesting because we have really, I'll say, fortunate geography and fortunate geology that enables geothermal. Kind of a way to describe it is if you kind of look at the interstates and some of the prominent cities. So everything kind of east of I-35, kind of eastern Texas, northeast Texas, great for geothermal. Definitely the deep geothermal. South of I-10, so you kind of get a little bit lower part of the Texas, great location. And then kind of the area out around El Paso. So those are kind of the three primary areas. So along the coast, pretty much East Texas, Northeast Texas, kind of southern Texas, and then way out West Texas. Those are the primary areas. Now, for shallow geothermal, pretty much anywhere in the state, depending on what type of system you want to put in, a shallow geothermal, hundreds of feet versus a deep geothermal, thousands of feet. There's advantages to various locations, but I say primarily for the deep geothermal, those 3 areas. Anywhere else for shallow geothermal.
That was actually going to be my next question, because you said deep and shallow, and I was like, how deep are we talking? How shallow are we talking? I didn't realize, like, hundreds of feet. That's actually kind of interesting. I know there's some of that I've even seen around in Austin and stuff, and people are doing it with like homes and residential and things like that. It's such a kind of interesting space. Why is it important, I guess, then when we're talking about all of this, with our role? Why is it to have that permitted and regulated? What do we need to look out for as a regulatory agency? What are we protecting? What are we kind of permitting?
For geothermal, because it's in Texas, it's defined as a Class 5 underground injection control well, which is Environmental Protection Agency's program, also known as UIC program, various classes of wells. This is an injection well, which falls under those classes. So as a Class 5 geothermal injection well, that's regulated by the Railroad Commission because we were given authority under primacy to regulate those types of wells. So when the Texas legislature defined pretty much all geothermal wells, shallow and deep, as Class 5, then everything kind of aligned to move everything under the Railroad Commission. So that's kind of the legal framework behind it. And in terms of kind of the actual nuts and bolts of it, because we have a background in energy, oil, gas, pipelines, and various sources of regulating the subsurface, it naturally made sense for it to fall under jurisdiction of the Railroad Commission.
It sounds like, I mean, I'm sure there's some different nuances with all of these, but a lot of those same considerations we're looking for with other wells, with protecting groundwater, protecting natural resources. This just kind of falls into that same umbrella, just under a different class of well.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of you alluded to earlier about the depths. So subsurface is subsurface. And so for the same types of reviews that our staff would do for any type of well, this falls into that, because you're talking about penetrating the subsurface, conducting some sort of activity in the subsurface, and that carries risk. And so most of the time what we're looking at as a kind of the two guiding areas is, I kind of put this in layman's terms, don't torch groundwater and don't cause things to move really big, or in this case, induce seismicity, or protection of underground sources of drinking water, which are kind of the...
And these are the same guidelines that we would have. I mean, this all comes down through EPA and through all these different... This is all very heavily regulated stuff. This is, even though it's somewhat newer to the commission, this is all a well-established framework, from what I understand.
It is. So that regulatory framework is kind of where it fits in. And what we're doing with that existing regulatory framework from the federal or other things that we've regulated in the past, we kind of augment it with new rules and regulations, and to a certain extent, processes for permitting.
And what are some of those processes as far as like safeguards that are in place to like really protect? I mean, I know we've talked with other guests that we've had on there. We look at certain things with depth and locations of groundwater and stuff like that. Like, what are you guys looking for with as far as like safeguards to protect these resources?
It's the same sort of items. And so when you're looking at different depths, definitely underground sources of drinking water and whatever depths those happen to be at. We're looking at the potential for induced seismicity, although that tends to be pretty low, particularly with closed loop systems, because all the working fluid's actually in the pipes. So you're not going to really have a change in the pressures within that reservoir. So that's kind of taken care of in the design process. So we go down that list of items. If you want to get into environmental, kind of looking at that, if there were any sort of contact with geothermal resources, which would be the working fluid, with anything in the subsurface, that's something that we review. Although that risk is pretty low because the working fluid tends to be water, and that water is not contaminated. So you're not going to have the same sort of risk that you might have with other resources that you extract from the ground.
And again, with those closed loop ones, that's the one where, I mean, basically water's piped down, gets heated up, and comes back up. And that's it's going to be generating something once it returns to the surface, coming down cold, coming up hot.
Yeah, and it particularly if it's in that closed loop, that you're just cycling that water. Now, we do look at the volumes of water being cycled just to ensure that there's no risk with pressure bursting the pipe. But we do that with any of the areas that we regulate. Like if we're looking at casing, we're looking at depth, we're looking at operation, we're looking at well drilling, the well design. So all of those things are that we normally do with oil or gas wells. We do with geothermal wells. And so with some differences with respect to how geothermal wells and their facilities operate.
So how does the permitting process for a geothermal well compare or differ to oil and gas well?
I kind of talk about how the similarities, because they're pretty similar. I would say that the processes are pretty much the same. If you've worked with the Railroad Commission or gotten any sort of permit, it goes through that same process. There's a financial assurance. You send in a packet. It will be reviewed by the staff. If we have any questions, we'll ask. If there's any concerns, then we would bring that up. We'd resolve those concerns. You got your financial assurance in place. It meets the regulatory requirements to be permitted. Your packet gets approved and you get a permit. Now, in terms of the main difference with geothermal versus the oil and gas is really the permitting team for the geothermal wells is a special injection team, which they permit, and they're out of the technical permitting directorate, which does underground injection control. So if you're familiar with the Class 2 process, that's that directorate, and that team falls under that directorate. And they're basically all Class 5 wells. Now, in terms of oil and gas permits, they're managed by drilling permits, which is out of Administrative Compliance Directorate, but we all fall under the oil and gas division for that consistency. So the framework is a little bit different from oil and gas because it is an underground injection control well. So injection wells versus oil and gas wells, because you're moving resources versus putting them back in the ground. And that's really the main difference. But I'd say that consistency is that it falls under the oil and gas division. So those processes are, been pretty well tested over decades, and the IT systems are the same.
So if there's familiarity, like you said, if you filed one, you might be able, it's not going to be whole new territory for someone necessarily.
No, in a lot of cases, it's the same staff reviewing the permits. It's just maybe in terms of the forms, they may be a little bit different because, again, you're not removing something from the ground. You're putting something in or cycling something through. So that would be different. But in terms of all the other reviews or processes, that look and feel of being at the Railroad Commission is pretty much the same.
Are there any common questions or misconceptions that like operators who are looking to get into this? I know we just permitted our first geothermal well in 2025, but what are some of the things that you get like questions about when it comes to like looking at the geothermal program, or things when you guys were first stepping things up? Like, what do we know we need to address?
A couple of the things that come up are kind of the spacing rules. So that's one of the questions, particularly when it comes to the lease itself, because oil and gas tends to be predicated on the lease. You get a lease, you put X number of wells, you got spacing because you're removing a resource from the reservoir. In geothermal, let's say that you had a deep geothermal closed loop, but the closed loop portion of it is actually the reservoir. So that reservoir is not making contact with anything else. You got an injector and a producer, and you're just pulling heat, cycling water, and getting steam through that. So that's a definition of a closed loop as well. So in that case, you would really kind of be looking at how do we characterize the permit for those types of designs. And that tends to be something that's different than oil and gas because it's pretty consistent with, really kind of the big change in oil or gas is really the horizontal versus the vertical in that technology. Well, most geothermal are some derivative of that. So that, and I've seen people ask about, well, how do you regulate that? They call it the loop. It's not really a loop, but be that as it may, it kind of looks like a loop in 2 dimensions. And so we look at that cycling. What's the design? What's happening in the reservoir? Go down all those other requirements to make a determination on the permit. So those things are a little bit different in the review process because they operate differently and are designed differently. But for the most part, in terms of the review itself, we go through that process based off of federal and state laws and the processes we've had in place for a while. So that part of it's fairly consistent.
What sort of, when you're talking about all of this sort of up and running, what does that life cycle look like for one of these projects? Because I imagine there has to be exploration because there's different everything's kind of like you said, all over Texas.
It kind of depends on the type of well. So I was talking about before. So is it shallow or deep? So are we talking kind of ground source heat pump, or are we talking like deep into the earth? Is it, vertical or horizontal in kind of orientation? What is the construction methodology? Is it an open loop? Is it closed loop? Is it an advanced geothermal system, an enhanced geothermal system, or is it geopressured type of system, or some variation, which is what makes it a little interesting in these times of the geothermal, because all of these different techniques are being developed based off of, again, like in Texas having that geology and geography. There are advantages to those different types of systems depending on what location you're at in Texas. And so that part of it in terms of the exploration is, okay, where do you need energy? And then kind of what type of activity is going to be conducted there. Look for those optimal areas, do the research. And then it kind of depends from that on the land and subsurface availability and then being able to get the lease. So all of those considerations have to kind of be taken in place before you even go down the road of, are we going to do a geothermal well? Is it practical to do it there? Can we do it there? And can we get the land? And then at that point you go, okay, let's put in a permit. And then if those conditions are met and you have that access to the property and the project is viable economically and regulatory wise, then you kind of move forward. And that's the part where it gets in. Now it kind of moves to the Railroad Commission. There's the packet, which has got to have financial assurance for the deep geothermal wells, not the shallow. And then in some cases, the operator may get a test well just to check. And in fact, we had that with the first well that we permitted is there's kind of this test phase. So you're doing exploratory, ensuring that design can actually scale up to what you intended to do. And in this case, produce power power that was needed for the design of the geothermal infrastructure. So that was the part where there's a lot that kind of goes into it because it is rarely new. It's not something that a design like that is not something that's been tested, a number of years. These are kind of new designs that have been modeled, and they found a place in Texas where that model made the most sense and optimally performed.
Okay.
Tested it, we were able to get through the permit process, and so far so good. So I think that's kind of what's changed in terms of kind of traditionally knowing, having all this data for oil or gas, because once you've entered a reservoir, there's oil or gas there, space it out, put another one. Geothermal is a little bit different, but in terms of the life cycle of the process, that's kind of how it goes to permitting, production, cycling of water in most cases, and then being able to, extract heat from those processes and turn it into energy.
I would imagine, though, that because we've talked with Central Records folks and stuff before, just the plethora of data that is available on oil and gas wells. I hear at the commission, there's probably a lot of interesting data sets. You said with your background doing GIS and things like that here, too. There's a lot of work that's already kind of been done. Folks, it's not necessarily a hunt out there to find. They know what they're looking for, more or less.
Some of the recent interest in geothermal has gotten more researchers involved. They're putting a new geothermal map in place. It hasn't been updated in a couple of decades. The first one that was kind of published for use was from Southern Methodist University. And then as this growth in geothermal is happening here in Texas, things have changed. But in that plethora of data, if you go to what's in a well log, all the parameters that you can derive from a well log are really important to finding good places for geothermal, particularly if you're looking at bottom hole temperatures. And the other thing that's kind of changed is the ability to process that data. So from a GIS standpoint, definitely you can do all kinds of analysis, but also with the kind of the 3D subsurface software that's available, you can now put all this data that you can get pretty much for free from the Railroad Commission. Now it takes a little research and things, but the ability to do that has changed. What might have taken months or maybe years is now kind of days and weeks. So that's changed the cost and the timeline for geothermal energy.
One thing I really want to kind of note to the listeners out there that's really interesting about all of this is it's building upon a lot of things that we already have in place, but this is really new territory for not just the commission, but the industries and things looking all this is an exciting time to be around all of this.
Oh, absolutely. I would say just kind of in Texas, because we have good geology, good geography, and an existing regulatory framework that we can augment sources, if you will. It makes it exciting because now, not just from a technical standpoint, but also from a governance standpoint, from a business and in academics. There's a new conference that's starting this year up at Southern Methodist University where they're talking about, using geothermal and data centers. So I was like, well, I would think they would focus on a whole lot more, but no, that's kind of where this is going. So we're looking at these different sources because other sources have already been characterized. We've got them in place, but this is just another area of energy research and probably energy usage that has kind of been on the back burner for a number of years.
Are there any other technologies or research areas that you think are probably tying it with data centers and things? Are there anything else there that you're either kind of keen on or excited about? They're like, ooh, that's going to be something cool to keep an eye on.
Artificial intelligence. So one of the things I was recently doing some research on, what's going on in the applications world, but just the ability to take an enormous amount of data, put it in matrix form and crunch numbers and figure out where these items are best. Because what would take geologists a number of, I would say, years to do. Now this data is available. It's been available for a long time in different arenas. It's just getting it all together and knowing what you need, and then running these models to figure out these optimal areas. So I think that's not just AI itself, but just everything kind of around artificial intelligence allows you to do these things and find areas and also discount data that kind of suppresses that which isn't useful for geothermal. And that saves time and cost so companies can go, okay, this totally makes sense for an investment, or that may be in the too hard to do box now, but it also gives surety for us as regulators, kind of knowing these are the areas that we see the growth in so we can scale up staff or be able to kind of train staff on these different techniques as well.
And you're talking about these data centers. Speaking of the future, I mean, these things are popping up, especially all over Texas. What should landowners know if they're approached about geothermal development on their property, either for that or to service a data center or just for, drilling wells and things like that?
Pretty much any time that you have a question about anything regulated by the Railroad Commission, I would say get a hold of the staff at the Railroad Commission and find what commodity is. And so for the special injection permit unit here at the Railroad Commission, or honestly anybody in technical permitting, you guys, so you could help out, and definitely myself, because as this comes up, the first thing you're going to go, well, who regulates it and why are you asking me the question? And then if you're a landowner, you're definitely going to go down the road of putting, geothermal assets on your property, probably a good idea to reach out to an attorney who has a background in energy and specifically geothermal, because that way you can kind of understand, well, am I grouping this into different kind of mineral rights? And then geothermal energy, it's who owns the heat. That's the surface owner, which is a little bit different than the oil and gas. And so now you're getting into understanding of minerals. And if you, let's say you came from another state and you bought property here in Texas and you retire here and you want to, do agriculture on it, you want to extract the resources from it, and you try to apply that framework where a mineral may be something different defined in a law in another state versus here, I would ask that question from the Railroad Commission staff because we regulate it, and then maybe get an attorney involved so you can work through those issues.
There's so many little nuances to all this, and I know we get lots of questions with our folks, and anyone who ever has any questions about that, you can go to our website, and we have all sorts of resources. You can there's all sorts of numbers, emails, everything for all these types of questions on all sorts of different stuff, because I know we get all sorts of contacts all the time from landowners just with general questions about all sorts of pieces to all of this. So
it's just evolving. It's crazy. Everyone thinks of Texas, oil and gas immediately, but then there's all these other different technologies that we have. It's the 21st century. It's what we'd expect, right?
Yeah, I would say even with these different well designs. So if you've got one of those geo-pressured wells where you're doing hydraulic fracturing to open up space, you're putting water in there in kind of a hot area underground, and then you're pumping that back up based off of the pressure. That's a different sort of design, and it's a different sort of considerations for minerals, because is it your water? Are you pumping water in? Are you capturing some source? Then you might have to go to another regulatory agency for that resource before it becomes a geothermal associated resource, because water separated from it, different than water, like produced water in injection, like for oil and gas injection. And then you kind of go, well, it kind of changes form. Same thing with geothermal. So that falls in, where does it fall in geothermal energy and associated resources? If you're using that water in a geothermal system, is it some different form of working fluid you want to use in that closed loop system that may or may not be allowable under Texas regulations? So it's those kinds of considerations that we can help you out with.
If I do want to know about all this, I'm a member of the public and I've got questions about hearing about a geothermal project in my area, or I'm interested in some of these regulatory decisions. I know there's always rulemaking happening at the commission over time. What are some of the best ways to stay informed?
The best way is check out our website. We have a geothermal webpage that's updated pretty regularly. As changes happen that impact those who may want to get a permit or those already operating geothermally, then that website's a good place. I would say to kind of stay up on kind of the current issues in Texas. The Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance, one of the trade associations here, has a pretty good website, and they cover a broad gamut of geothermal topics.
It's really interesting. I have been looking forward to this topic in particular because it is such an emerging just thing that's happening. It's exciting to see all of this and know that we have a big part in this in keeping natural resources safe, protecting groundwater, and then just seeing this whole thing develop here in Texas, because it's a really exciting time. I would say if there was one big takeaway from folks, what would you want them to know about just understanding geothermal?
Yeah, I'd say kind of grouping it together is kind of three highlights. Is like the interest in geothermal energy in Texas is growing. And my guess is it's probably going to surge over the next decade. So from growing to surging, and I kind of said this before, Texas has kind of fortunate geography, geology, and we have that regulatory environment to enable kind of optimal geothermal operations. And I think that's what makes us a little bit different from other places that you could do this, because we have all those things kind of in place already. And then the one thing about geothermal energy is it's 24/7, it's dispatchable, it's renewable. The other part is kind of high capacity with respect to other energy sources. And all the geothermal fits into the existing kind of energy infrastructure here in Texas. And the other part is low risk.
Well, Jarrett, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate this. Hopefully our listeners got something out there. Among the many things that's kind of under the RRC umbrella on the regulatory front, geothermal energy is a really exciting thing that needs to be kind of on the forefront of. And again, as we kind of learn more about all the different things we do, I know we're going to have some other interesting topics in the future. For any listeners out there who want to go back, maybe hear some of these other episodes, this one we talked a lot, alluding to some past conversations. Nick, where can we find folks?
We are on almost every podcast app imaginable. We're out there on the popular ones, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, YouTube. We're out there. We're pretty easy to find. Remember to subscribe so you can get those notifications, and that'll let you know when a new episode is released. We do it every other Wednesday. You get that little notification on your phone. And I thought of something else too. I think you can listen to us on the Amazon Alexa devices too, because that's part of the Audible music. So that's kind of cool. I haven't mentioned that before. I haven't thought about that, but I'm pretty sure, I'm almost positive we can do that too. We're on X, we're at TXRRC, LinkedIn and Facebook, we're Railroad Commission of Texas, Instagram as well, at Railroad Commission of Texas. I mentioned YouTube. You can just search for us, Railroad Commission of Texas. We make it pretty easy to find resources, not only for the podcast, but also other information that we put out there on social media and videos and things like that.
So for anyone out there who does want to find out more about geothermal or any of our permitting processes or rulemaking, any of that stuff, you can also subscribe to some newsletters and different things. That's all on our website at rrc.texas.gov. And as always, this has been Texas Energy on Track, the official podcast of the Railroad Commission of Texas. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you all soon.